So welcome everyone to tonight's Dharma talk, which is about how we recognize the universe in all beings. So it's a talk about compassion. So compassion, or karuna, is one of the 4 heart qualities. And it's a practice and a nourishment for our hearts. And it's an essential medicine for a troubled world. We can know compassion as a universal movement of the heart. And in this, we're asked to accept this invitation and turn towards pain and suffering, our own and that of others. Compassion's a practice, it's a skill and an embodied way of being. We can think about compassion as empathy plus action. It's this desire to alleviate suffering. And the Dalai Lama said that if you want to know what compassion is, to look into the eyes of a mother as she cradles her sick and fevered child. Compassion's a powerful energy that can dissolve harshness and cruelty. It can also heal our hearts even when pain endures. There are seeds of compassion waiting to be awakened in each of our hearts that allow us to reach our true potential as human beings. Compassion's a quality that we can practice to generate strength, peace, and joy, and to ripple these qualities out through consciousness in ever-widening circles. When we reflect on acts of kindness and the presence of others that touch our hearts deeply, this can often move us to tears. There's such a simplicity that emerges when we're listening deeply to another, and also when we have that sense of being listened to deeply. It means that all of our ideas about ourselves can be dissolved in a heartbeat when we feel that compassion and presence from another. It also is a really powerful way where we remember that we're not alone, and also that we are enough. Compassion can develop right view, and in sensing who we truly are so that we can embody right action and remember how to live in right relationship with the earth and all beings. So how do we recognize the universe in all beings? To recognize the universe in all beings is to wake up. And this can happen through relational processes or spiritual friendships known in Pali as Kalyanamitta. And it's what we're practicing here on retreat. It's so beautiful. You can feel into this transformative alchemy that invites us to live and breathe from our hearts instead of our heads. It can be a radical shift in how we relate to others. And because our ego and the I-making both arise and dissolve, often through relationship. And when we can sort of have a different experience of ourselves in relationship, this can help to actually dissolve some of those egoic traits or characteristics. So helping us to remember, following on from Ali's talk and our beautiful discussion this morning about the elements, it can help us to remember our interconnectedness with all things and to lean into this myth of separation. When asked about the importance of spiritual friendship, the Buddha famously said, Good friends, companions, and associates are the whole of the spiritual life. A mendicant with good friends, companions, and associates can expect to develop and cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path. And he identified generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom as being direct antidotes to the root causes of suffering, which are greed, hatred, and delusion. So as Dharma practitioners, our practice and presence can be of benefit to the world during these times of great disruption and disconnect. Coming to understand that spiritual practice is not separate from activism, but is the heart and foundation of compassionate action and change. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about engaged Buddhism and how we show up in the world based on something pretty amazing that happened in Bellingen towards the end of last year. But just to go back to talk a little about engaged Buddhism first, it's, as we know, engaged Buddhism is the application of Buddhist wisdom to issues in the world that are happening, including climate change, the violence of colonialism, systemic racism, war, and poverty. It asks us to find compassion and look deeply into these causes of suffering. To understand, as the Buddha said, that a finger pointing to the moon is not the moon, so that we can be motivated to contribute to a path of right action. Engaged Buddhism asks us to contemplate, how do we take refuge in the three jewels in a time of ecological collapse? Can we cultivate the Brahma Viharas and see how the heart qualities help us to connect with ourselves, each other, and the earth? And how do we embody the Noble Eightfold Path, not just on our cushions, but actively in our communities? So an example of this, which is related to the story that I'm going to share about what happened in Bellingen, is about that colonialism is a really good example of something that didn't just happen in the past in Australia, but it's a dependently arising complex system of greed, delusion, and power that continues today. And we have a framework of understanding through the Buddha's teaching to see that injustice, oppression, environmental destruction don't exist in a vacuum, but they're fed by systems, habits, and mindsets that we can turn towards and ultimately transform or, in some cases, dismantle. And how do we do this together? Well, the poet and social activist Bell Hooks said, "Indeed, all the great movements for social justice in our society have strongly emphasized a love ethic." And this is powerful when people work together, breathing life into the insights of interdependence that are revealed through our Dharma practice that move us towards collective action. And I'd just like to share this story in the spirit of engaged Buddhism that happened on the lands of the Gumbaynggirr Nation where we lived, and it happened over the summer solstice, which is the week just preceding Christmas last year, when the Gumbaynggirr Nation hosted an international gathering to create a platform for the voices of First Nations peoples from all over the planet to contribute to the discourse about climate emergency and to offer different perspectives about how we protect the sacred earth and all beings. So these are my reflections as a friend and ally standing in solidarity with my beloved First Nations friends as we engaged in a process of working together where we had to dig deeply to find courage and a strong commitment to help each other, and in our practice of compassionate action. So in the beginning of 2024, a very small group of us that included First Nations and non-First Nations people began working together. We met weekly, we shared long conversations and organised within community. We had no dedicated funding or streams of support and very little resources, with most resources offered by members within and just outside the group, and local sponsorship came from one Aboriginal organisation. But through working together, we contemplated the meaning of what it is to be human. And it felt like this deepened human connections and allowed us to kind of deepen our understanding of each other. And we did this through, there was always food, and within this, the relational foundation of the group began to take shape as we found commonalities and made agreements for how we could be together. One of my most profound memories in this process was approaching a government organisation in Bellingen to book Gumbaynggirr lands for 6 days for this event to take place. And there were 4 of us that went. There were 2 Gumbaynggirr elders and myself and another non-Indigenous woman. And this is where I sense our practice of engaged Buddhism can be really helpful in letting us know how to meet the present moment and to keep, knowing when to speak and when not to speak, and to embody deeply what Roshi Joan Halifax says as a soft front and a strong back. So within this meeting, there were institutional policies and procedures that kind of epitomised often things that we don't even question, colonial kind of structures. And to see the Gumbaynggirr elders presented with a bill for $10,000 to basically, have access to their own lands just didn't make sense. So there was also a lot of impossibility within the language that was used, and this dominating perspective of, this is how we do things in mainstream Australia. But I remember the gentleness and the softness of the elders as they spoke in that meeting. And as non-Indigenous community members, we were there completely to stand in solidarity. During one of the early meetings, my beautiful friend, she's an awesome woman in Bellingen, said to this organisation, "So how much rent have you actually paid to Gumbaynggirr over the years?" And that was just met with incredulity, but it also shifted perspective, I think. So again, it's how we stand up. She was amazing. And it felt like from that meeting, there was a shift in consciousness and a glimpse of what might be possible as they agreed to work with us to create a change in community in relation to this discourse and how Gumbaynggirr people could have a voice in what's happening, climate emergency. But really sadly, later this agreement was rescinded in part, which was another blow for Gumbaynggirr. And in that, I witnessed how peoples who've been let down again and again through systemic racism, injustice and broken promises have little attachment to hope or things being different. And as the Earth Summit drew closer, the colonial legacy of trauma created many obstacles and behavioural patterns amongst all of us, which energised what we know as the 8 worldly winds. And there were so many challenging moments when things almost fell apart. Lateral violence is a painful legacy of colonialism. It's a way, it's like displaced violence where anger's directed towards members of a marginalised or oppressed community rather than towards the oppressors. And it's a kind of sideways gossip underpinned by fear and hatred. It divides communities and keeps people from stepping up and stepping forward. And racism often reveals its insidious roots through apathy and mistrust. And it's so easy for us humans to turn away or numb out or engage in what Joanna Macy's describes as business as usual. Another obstacle that arises often in engaged Buddhist practices is spiritual bypassing. And also there's something called performative activism, where there's still, at the core of performative activism is still I, me, mine. People kind of wanting to be seen to be doing the right thing. And something I've come to understand is how easy it is for us as non-Indigenous people to disengage when the going gets tough and return to a world that's comfortable through our privilege. And this isn't the same deal for Indigenous people whose cultural practices mean protecting the sacred or giving up is never a choice. It's been a humbling and heartfelt experience that at times has been deeply challenging, being connected to this group that's led by First Nations elders, scholars and visionaries from the Americas, Australia and the Pacific. And some of these group members were involved in the peaceful, prayerful protest that was Standing Rock in 2016, where thousands gathered to protect the sacred Missouri River from an oil pipeline. And this movement awakened the world to Indigenous-led activism arising from a deeply spiritual space that points to how we can live in right relationship with the earth. So in Bellingen, the Earth Summit involved many original nations and peoples sharing their perspectives and efforts to protect the sacred. We heard from a fiercely compassionate Gamilaroi elder who'd recently been to the COP Summit and the International Climate Change Conference, and she spoke of efforts to protect the Pilliga from a multinational gas company. There were 2 extraordinarily courageous matriarchs, Namba women from near Brewarrina, who are protecting the ancient fish traps, and they travelled for hours to share their stories. The fish traps are thought to be more than 40,000 years old, and which makes them amongst the oldest human-made structures on the planet. We witnessed immense grace from our Gumbaynggirr leaders and from the courage of the women whose mothers had to walk 30 kilometres to give birth in a segregated New South Wales hospital. Our visiting Lakota friends reminded us to care for the women and to walk in our values. We were touched by the unconditional during the opening ceremony when a beautiful man who'd travelled for days from El Salvador to share his knowledge of the deep spirituality from within the complex systems of permaculture paused and spoke to our hearts while he prayed with tears in his eyes, asking the Creator to help us. There were so many magical moments during the Earth Summit, particularly in the way that our local Dharma group and community members showed up in support of Gumbaynggirr. There were also, in the area that we live, there are the most extraordinary young people who have dedicated their lives to protecting the forests, and many have given up their jobs and the forest, but that's a whole other story in the area. So they showed up knowing exactly what to do and how to support Gumbaynggirr. It was so beautiful. It was like witnessing and embodying of right action, particularly by these young people, as a powerful and direct antidote to hopelessness and despair. But as with many beautiful moments, there was also a lot of pain and unprocessed trauma in this space, and that created many painful divisions and splits. And it was where, we could witness the near and far enemies of compassion showing up in action. It was the breakdown in relationships during and after the Earth Summit that I continued to grieve. There was dissension, there was splitting, there was lack of harmony within our group. We didn't create a solid foundation or a safe container for coming together. And despite these challenges, the lessons for me, I think, have been to remember that love isn't conditional, and that pain is so connected to the storms of our conditioned experiences. And that in Australia, our colonial legacy of genocide, violence, dispossession and decimation of culture for First Nations peoples, particularly on the east coast of Australia, must be met with courage and the heart. Ruth King says that racism is a heart disease and it's curable. She says that it's only by grounding our practice in the relative realm do we find what the poet T.S. Eliot calls the fruits of ultimate reality. And my insights from the Earth Summit include a need for us to investigate at a group level what it means to actually be a white-skinned person in Australia, and what this means to them work in the intercultural space. Something that was challenging that I witnessed in this space was there's almost like a competition between us non-First Nations peoples, and looking more deeply into that, I sense that it's part of colonial culture and maybe even like a legacy of the subjugation of women, and patterns where we enact our submissive conditioning that creates dissension, competition and mistrust of each other. I don't think we had a strong enough foundation in our group to look at how some of these patterns would show up. And we also didn't make a space to look at how conflict would be resolved. In the end, I also felt a lot of sadness and grief that all of our skills and talents weren't recognised. And there's a beautiful Samoan Maori man in Bellingen who says that in these times, all of our gifts are necessary in coming together, that it's not just one perspective, it's going to take everybody stepping forward. At the relative level, the Earth Summit was a platform for the voices of Original nations and peoples. At the absolute level, it was a transformative space of learning and touching into emptiness through opening our hearts. So, what gets in the way of us recognizing the universe in each other? We know that the delusion or the myth of separateness creates like a duality and othering. And This is prevalent throughout the course of human history, resulting in wars, dissension, violence, and all the other isms, including colonialism, that are connected strongly with suffering. And while relational transformation challenges us to live and breathe from our hearts, it can also reveal stories that are held deeply in our bodies through pain and illness and aging. And to turn away from this pain and suffering is to follow a path of denial, avoidance, and agitation. A life disconnected from the story of all beings. And Rumi pointed to this universal truth when he said, "Don't turn away. Keep looking at the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you. And don't believe for a moment you're healing yourself." So it seems that there's a lot of work that we have to do in Australia to recognise how all of these patterns show up for us and what we need to do in making these spaces to come together in the future. Riesma Menakem writes in his beautiful book, My Grandmother's Hands, that there are two types of pain. And he speaks of clean pain as metabolized and processed trauma, and dirty pain as that which remains unprocessed, yet arises surreptitiously in our interactions with the world. And a question that I'm really unsure of how to answer from this work in an intercultural space involves how do we allow ourselves to not be okay and to care for each other while creating these containers for how we come together. And the Buddha urged us to wake up and see that our habit energy of greed, hatred, and delusion are at the core of suffering. And he offered, so you should view this fleeting world, a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream. And the translator to His Holiness the Dalai Lama speaks about when we can meet pain with loving kindness, and we begin with practicing with our own pain, that there's an alchemy that results in compassion. Throughout history, there have been extraordinary acts of compassion. Gandhi standing steadfast with an open heart in non-violent protests against colonialism in India. Nelson Mandela's long walk to freedom in his courageous quest for social justice. Mother Teresa's dedication to establishing hospices and homes for people with HIV and leprosy. The courage and ongoing generosity of First Nations peoples in protecting the earth in the face of devastating social and environmental injustice. And the extraordinary heart minds of Tibetan monks tortured in prisons in Tibet who feared losing compassion for their captors more than they feared death. A question that the much respected and much loved Native American activist Myron Dewey asked when he was here in Australia a few years ago was, how can we help people to see through Indigenous eyes? And Myron was tragically killed not long after he was here in Australia, but his question is imprinted in my heart and I've never stopped thinking about it. And I think what Myron was talking about is what we might know as right view and right action. So how do we understand right view so we can embody compassionate action? and learn to live in right relationship with the earth and each other. And Tara Brach says that the starting place in all healing is embracing even the most painful and shameful parts of our inner experience. Compassion for ourselves naturally leads to caring about others and eventually unfolds into an unconditional and inclusive love for life we never imagined possible. But it's in those ouch moments, the reactive disconnection from our bodies seem to be the cause of immense suffering, of relationship difficulties and energetic blockages that can lead to chronic health conditions and keep us turned away from the bandaged place, stuck in these reactive cycles of samsara. And our vulnerability lies in our reactivity that arises like steam from the murky depths of our confusion. The Buddha spoke of how we can cause ourselves suffering, that if we're shot with a dart in the leg, how we respond to the pain is a deciding element in whether we continue to suffer and how much we suffer. If we react with anger and hatred and blame and confusion, we relegate aversion, fear, shame, and contempt to propel us into these cyclic patterns of suffering. And it's in these patterns that can be deeply known and relinquished through our practice of compassion. Moments of compassion leave indelible imprints on our hearts and lie at the core of aspiration and spiritual life. This beautiful Tibetan monk, Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, says, when I began to practice meditation on compassion, I found that my sense of isolation began to diminish, while at the same time my personal sense of empowerment began to grow. Where I once saw only problems, I started to see solutions. Where once I viewed my own happiness as more important than the happiness of others, I began to see the well-being of others as the foundation of my own peace of mind. So it's the simple activities of our daily life, including the simplicity of being present with others, that we can nurture these qualities of love and compassion. Love, being our birthright, is a universal healing energy. And in pointing to that scientific truth of quantum physics, Albert Einstein said, famously, our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. And this so parallels the worldviews of First Nations peoples and the teachings of the Buddha. The Zen teacher, David Loy, I heard him be asked a few years ago, David, why do we meditate? And David said, we meditate so we can balance the relative and the absolute and help with the healing of the world. We are gifted with precious skills through our Dharma practice that can transform consciousness and help us see the universe in each other. And may we find new ways to come together to correct injustices, to dismantle racism and greed, to unravel our conditioning, to remember who we are and protect the forests, rivers, oceans, skies, and Mother Earth in our lifetimes and beyond for the generations to come. Thank you. Thank you for your kind, compassionate presence. We might just sit for a minute and allow those words to dissolve.